What decides the worth of a soul at the instant it leaves the body? The Norse world did not trust glory to accident. It set watchers over every battlefield. Not angels, but auditors. The Valkyries were not winged maidens of welcome. They were the cosmic filter, the machinery that sifted the elite from the forgotten, and they answered to no one but the cold need of a god who had already seen the end of everything. Now, let that thought settle. Let your shoulders fall. Just slightly away from your ears. There is nowhere else you need to be. If it feels right, let your eyes close now, or leave them open. Either way, you are already where you need to be. Picture, if you like, a sky torn open by the first light of a winter dawn. Below, a field of the fallen, the cold iron smell of blood and frost. Smoke from distant pyres drifts across the silence, and somewhere above the cloud line, a shape descending gaunt, winged with storm, neither mother nor executioner. Something far older. It has been riding toward this battlefield since the beginning of the world. It has not come to save or to damn. It has come to measure. This story holds a truth that the sagas never quite spoke aloud. It is a truth about what it means to be chosen, and what it costs to be passed over. And it has waited a long time to be received. If these are the stories that call to you, then you are already one of those who listen for old voices. There is no urgency here, only the quiet assurance that when you return, the tale will still be here. So let the path carry you back. Back before the Golden Hall was built, before the first warrior lifted his sword toward an uncaring sky, to the moment when the All-Father looked into the darkness and understood that he could not face it alone. Chapter 1. When the Gods First Feared. Before there were choosers, there was a silence that frightened a god. In the high seat of Hlidskjalf, the All-Father sat motionless, his single eye fixed on a horizon no other being could see. The ravens had returned with their whispers. They had seen the end of all things, the wolf's jaw yawning wide, the sky splitting into fire, the thrones of the gods toppling into a sea of ash. And Odin believed them, because he had asked them to look. This was not a vision he could unsee. The knowledge settled into him like cold iron laid against bone, permanent and inescapable. Ragnarök was not a possibility that might be averted with the right sacrifice or the cleverest rune. It was a fixed point in the weave of fate, as certain as the turning of seasons. The only question, and it was the question that would reshape the cosmos, was whether the gods would face that day alone or with an army at their backs. The world of men did not yet know what had been decided above them. In the frozen valleys and along the salt gray coasts, warriors still fought and died, as they always had, their souls slipping away into the mist with no hand to catch them. A man would fall with his sword in his grip, his blood staining the frost, and for one brief moment, something would flicker at the edge of his vision, a presence, half-sensed, that vanished before it could be named. Then, only silence remained. That silence was not peace. To the Norse, a death without witness was a death that had failed to register in the great accounting. The soul that slipped unmarked into the cold earth did not go to glory. It went to hell, a realm not of punishment, but of stillness, where nothing burned, and nothing sang, and nothing ever changed. The warriors whispered of it around their hearth fires, and their hands tightened on their ale horns. To die forgotten was the only true extinction. Odin understood this fear intimately. He had hung on the world tree for 9 nights, pierced by his own spear, to learn the runes that govern fate. And what he learned was that fate could not be broken, only armed. So the All-Father began to prepare. He sent word across the 9 realms, through raven and rumor, that a hall was being built in Asgard, unlike any that had ever been raised. Its roof would be of shields, its rafters would be spears, and it would stand empty until the dead themselves filled it. The construction of Valhalla was not a celebration. It was a gathering of materials for a war still centuries distant, Skilled dwarves and silent veneer laborers worked beneath a sky that never warmed, hammering gold into roof tiles and stretching oxhide across the vast inner walls. No mead was poured at the foundation laying. No feast was held when the 540th door was hung. The hall rose in grim, functional silence, a barracks built for souls who had not yet been born. And when it was finished, Odin walked its length alone. His footsteps echoed on stone that had never known a footfall. The benches stood empty, stretching row upon row into a darkness that no torch could fully chase away. The Allfather stopped before the central hearth, where a fire was meant to burn for the Einherjar, the chosen warriors who would feast and fight until the end of days. But the hearth was cold, and the hall was silent, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf was already howling. It is one thing to build a hall for the honored dead. It is another to fill it. Odin could not simply collect the soul of every warrior who fell. Courage alone was not enough, nor strength, nor even a death with a blade in hand. The army he needed would have to be more than brave. It would have to be unbreakable, forged from spirits so fierce that they would rise each morning after being slain and fight again, day after day, for centuries, until the wolf itself came to devour them. The criteria, in other words, were impossibly precise. Someone had to choose. The Allfather could not ride to every battlefield himself. His ravens could report, but they could not select. The Norns might weave fate at the foot of Yggdrasil, but they did not intervene in the moment of a single death. There was a gap in the machinery of the cosmos, a hollow space between the moment a warrior's heart stopped and the moment his soul drifted into the mist. And Odin, staring into that hollow, began to understand what would be required to fill it. It would require a being that was not quite God and not quite mortal, a being that could walk among the dying without being touched by death, that could assess the worth of a soul in the instant before it fled, that could reach into the carnage and lift the worthy skyward without hesitation or pity. It would require a hand cold enough to separate the fuel from the ash. And so, in the silence of his half-finished hall, the Allfather began to contemplate the shape of something the world had not yet seen, a chooser, winged and terrible, whose arrival on a battlefield would mean that the accounting had finally begun. To shape such a being, Odin first went downward, to the roots of the world tree, where the Norns weave the fates of men beside the well of Urthur. He did not ask them for a favor. The Allfather knew better than to owe a debt to the weavers of what must be. He watched instead. He studied the way their fingers moved across the threads, how a life was lifted from the loom, and another was cut short with no more effort than a woman snipping a loose strand from her weaving. What he saw there troubled him. The Norns did not choose. They simply enacted. The pattern was already set. If Odin wanted warriors selected for a specific purpose, he would need something the Norns had never possessed, a mind capable of judgment in the instant between breath and silence. And that mind could not be spun from cloud or carved from the root of a mountain. It would have to come from the one place in the 9 realms where choice and death met willingly, the heart of a mortal who had already chosen to die. On a nameless field in Midgard, under a sky the color of wet iron, a shield maiden fell. She had fought with a fury that startled even the berserkers around her, her axe splitting helms and shields until a spear found the gap beneath her arm. She dropped to her knees in the frozen mud, and as her vision narrowed to a dark tunnel, she felt something stop beside her. Not a god, not a beast, but a presence that smelled of ozone and cold stone. It had been waiting for her. Odin did not speak to her. He did not offer her a choice, because the choice had already been made when she lifted her axe that morning, knowing she would not set it down again. He reached into the falling dark and caught the thread of her soul before it could slip into the mist. And then, with the same hands that had hung on Yggdrasil for their runes, he began to unmake her. Not to destroy, to repurpose. Every memory of warmth, every attachment to name and kin, was drawn out like a thread and laid aside. What remained was a core of pure, unhesitating will, the part of a warrior that does not flinch when the blade comes. Into that core, Odin poured storm matter and the cold logic of necessity. He gave her wings, not of feather, but of the cloud that gathers before a killing frost. He gave her eyes that could see the value of a soul, as a smith sees the carbon in raw iron. And when he was finished, she rose from the battlefield no longer mortal, no longer a woman, but something that had no name yet in any language spoken under the sun. She did not weep for what she had lost. She could not. The capacity had been removed along with her memories. She simply stood in the blood-soaked snow, her new wings folding and unfolding, as if testing the weight of the sky, and waited for instruction. The warriors who had survived the battle had already fled. The only witnesses were the dead, and they offered no commentary. The first chooser stood alone on a field of the slain, and the silence that had frightened Odin was now hers to carry. There is no need to imagine her face too clearly. It is enough to know that it was still and cold and utterly unreadable. The being that had been a shield maiden now possessed a beauty that was inseparable from terror. The way a perfectly honed blade is beautiful until you see what it has done. Odin watched her from Hlidskjalf, and for a long moment, even the Allfather did not speak. He had succeeded in creating something that could choose the dead. He was no longer certain he understood what he had chosen to create. The answer was simple. Odin had built a filter, a mechanism for separating the useful dead from the forgotten, the fuel from the ash. The being he had made could walk among the dying and lift the worthy skyward with no hesitation and no pity, exactly as he had intended. But the contradiction was already stirring beneath that answer, like a serpent under ice. The chooser did not share his values. She did not weigh courage or honor or the love of a good name. She weighed only durability, the capacity to die and rise and die again without breaking. And so the first soul she chose was not a king, not a legendary hero whose name would outlast the mountains. It was a nameless spearman with a crooked back and hands that had gripped a shaft every day for 30 years without complaint. She lifted him because he would endure, because the wolf needed a meal that would take a long time to chew. And the warrior, rising into the storm sky, with the chooser's hand closed around his wrist, understood in that moment that he had not been honored. He had been harvested. Odin's hall would be filled. The army would be gathered. But the hands that did the gathering were not the warm golden maidens the sagas would later paint. They were auditors, cold and precise, and they answered to a logic even the Allfather could not fully unmake. The question that remained, hanging in the silent air over that first frozen battlefield, was not whether the choosers would succeed, it was what they would become across centuries of choosing, when the only thing they ever touched was the dying, and what the dying would become in their grip. Chapter 2. The Silence, where her name was. Not every Valkyrie was carved from a single woman's final breath. Some were never mortal at all. Odin, having shaped the first from sacrifice and storm, now understood the template, and he was not patient enough to wait for worthy deaths. He drew raw cloud matter from the highest reaches of the sky and spun it into form on the great loom of his will. These were beings of pure function, born adult and armored, their eyes already holding the aurora's cold accounting light. They rose from the thunderheads above Asgarder, without childhood, without mother, without any memory of a first breath that was not also a command. Their wings were the substance of the storm itself, crackling with silent lightning, and when they first opened their mouths, it was not to speak, but to receive Odin's instruction. They were beautiful in the way a perfectly cast spear is beautiful, every line and edge designed for a single purpose, with nothing left over that could be called excess. Yet the Allfather did not abandon the mortal source. He had seen what the Shield Maiden's core of unflinching will brought to the design, a resilience that Spun Cloud could not replicate. So his ravens began to watch the battlefields of Midgard, not only for warriors to fill his hall, but for women who died with a fury that matched his own. The criteria were narrower now. It was not enough to die with a blade in hand. The candidate had to choose death with full knowledge, eyes open, sword lifted toward a sky that had never promised to answer. When such a woman fell, the air around her would grow heavy. The survivors, if there were any, would feel a pressure in their ears, the kind that comes before a thunderclap, and they would retreat without knowing why. The dying woman, her vision fading, would sense a shape bending over her that was not quite God and not quite storm. And then the unmaking would begin. It was never quick. It was never gentle. It was simply necessary. The process was not punishment. Odin did not hate the women he transformed. He simply needed them to be other than what they were. So the memories were drawn out first, not violently, but patiently, like a healer removing splinters from a wound. The taste of her mother's bread, the sound of her father's voice, the name of the first child she had held, and the last lover she had kissed, all of it lifted away and set aside, somewhere beyond reach, somewhere that would never be opened again. What remained was the core, the part of a warrior that does not blink when the shield wall breaks, that does not drop the axe even when the arm holding it goes numb. Into that core, Odin poured the storm matter and the long sight and the cold, precise gift of valuation. The ability to see a dying soul and measure its durability as a smith measures the temper of steel. The body was remade around that core, taller, gaunter, armored in dark iron, etched with the runes of binding and purpose. The eyes were opened last. By then, they were no longer human. There is a moment in every transformation when the new Valkyrie first looks down at her own hands and does not recognize them. The calluses from years of gripping an axe haft are gone, replaced by skin as smooth as frozen water. The scars a slash across the knuckles from a parried blade, a burn from a cooking fire have vanished without a trace. She flexes her fingers and they move exactly as she commands, but they feel like borrowed instruments, tools left behind by a stranger who no longer has a name. Some of them sought their reflections in a meltwater pool on the edge of the battlefield, or in the polished curve of a fallen shield. They would catch sight of what they had become. A face of terrible, cold symmetry stared back. Beautiful, yes, but in the way a long-held note on a funeral horn is beautiful. The eyes held the aurora. The lips were still. The woman who had once laughed, who had once wept, who had once buried her face in a child's hair and breathed deep, was no longer visible. Only the function remained. And the function was this: to ride to every field where blood was being shed and to walk among the fallen, opening each dying soul like a ledger. The first time a newly forged Valkyrie performed this duty, something strange happened. She reached toward a warrior, a young man whose hand still twitched around his sword, and her fingers passed through the thread of his life without hesitation. She lifted him, and she felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not sorrow. The absence where those feelings should have been was the last gift Odin had given her. They called themselves the Valkyries, choosers of the slain. The name was not given by poets or by the warriors who whispered it around their fires. It was a functional designation, spoken by Odin in the cold hall of Valhalla as he addressed the first assembly of his harvesters. It meant exactly what it said, and nothing more. There was no poetry in it, no glory. The choosers received the name the way a scythe receives its name, as a description of the work it was made to do. In the beginning, there were only a few of them, a dozen perhaps, scattered across the 9 realms like seeds thrown into a winter wind. But each battle they attended produced more candidates. A shield maiden who held the line while her clan escaped. A queen who took up her husband's sword and died in the shield wall. A healer who walked into the fray, not to kill, but to pull the wounded clear, and was cut down for her mercy. All of them were seen. All of them were measured, and one by one, the worthy among them were lifted from the mud and remade. The Valkyries did not comfort one another. They had not been designed for comfort. When two choosers met above a battlefield, their wings darkening the sky like twin storm fronts, they exchanged no greeting. They simply adjusted their flight paths to avoid collision and continued their work. The concept of sisterhood, of shared experience, of grief confessed in a quiet moment, these things had been removed along with the memories. What remained was a cold, efficient network of auditors who moved through the dying like accountants through a ledger. Yet something lingered. In the deepest core of the mortal-born Valkyries, beneath the storm matter and the runes of binding, there remained a splinter of what they had been. It was not memory. Memory had been taken, but a kind of echo, a resonance that vibrated when they passed over a certain kind of death. A woman falling with a spear in her side. A child clutching a broken toy on the edge of a burned village. The chooser would pause, her wings faltering for just a fraction of a heartbeat. And then the cold logic would reassert itself, and she would move on. The Allfather, watching from Halit's Chauf, noticed these pauses. They troubled him not because they indicated suffering. Suffering could be ignored, but because they represented inefficiency. A chooser who hesitated, even for an instant, was a chooser who might one day choose incorrectly. So Odin wove deeper bindings into their design, reinforcing the coldness, smoothing away the splinters. And the pauses grew rarer, and the Valkyries grew more perfect. And somewhere, in a place that no longer existed, a woman who had once been a mother forgot the faces of her children entirely. The warriors of Midgard learned to recognize the signs of a Valkyrie's approach. Not by sight, the choosers rarely showed themselves before the battle was decided, but by the sudden chill that settled over a field moments before the first shield splintered. Men would feel the temperature drop, see their breath plume in air that had been warm only moments before, and they would know that the auditors were already present, already watching, already measuring the weight of souls that had not yet left their bodies. Some warriors welcomed the cold. They believed that dying under the gaze of a Valkyrie ensured passage to Valhalla, and so they fought with a ferocity that bordered on madness, seeking the wound that would open the door. Others feared it. They had heard the whispers that the choosers did not always lift the bravest, that sometimes a trembling boy who had never swung a sword was taken, while a veteran of 30 winters was left to sink into the mist. The criteria were invisible, inscrutable, and absolute. No appeal was possible. No prayer could change the calculation. The truth was simpler and colder than any warrior could have imagined. The Valkyries did not weigh courage or honor or the love of kin. They weighed only endurance, the capacity to be broken and remade. Broken and remade, day after day, century after century, without losing the will to fight. A berserker who burned too brightly and too briefly was worth less to them than a farmer who had spent 30 years gripping a plow and never once complained. The wolf did not need fire. The wolf needed meat that would take a long time to chew. So the harvest continued. Battle after battle, field after field, the Valkyries moved through the dying like a cold wind through a crop of wheat, and the Einherjar filled the benches of Valhalla, and the choosers themselves, cut off from memory and comfort and the small, warm things that make existence bearable, became something that even Odin had not fully anticipated. They did not grow cruel. Cruelty requires emotion, and emotion had been stripped from them. They grew indifferent, profoundly, perfectly indifferent. The dying were not souls to them. They were inventory. There is a silence that lives at the center of every Valkyrie. It is the space where a woman's name used to be, where her laughter used to echo, where her grief used to pool in the dark hours before dawn. That silence is not empty. It is filled with the accumulated weight of every death they have ever witnessed, every soul they have lifted or passed over, every frozen field they have crossed with their bare feet, never quite touching the blood-soaked ground. And no one, not Odin, not the Norns, not the wolf waiting at the end of time, can ever reach into that silence and bring back what was taken. The Valkyries were the perfect solution to a terrible problem. They filled Odin's hall. They forged his army. They did everything they were created to do. And they did it without complaint, without hesitation, without the faintest whisper of rebellion. But the contradiction was already woven into their design, as permanent as the runes on their armor. The Allfather had built his harvesters to be incapable of caring about the dead they chose. And now he had to trust the fate of the gods to an army assembled by beings who felt nothing at all. What that army would become, what the centuries of cold selection would produce, that was a question even Odin's ravens could not answer. Chapter 3. The Song the Dead Hear. By the time the second age of the world began to darken, the Valkyries were no longer a whisper. They were a system. Every corner of Midgard where iron met flesh fell under their jurisdiction. From the frozen coastal raids of the north to the slow, grinding border wars of the southern kingdoms. They did not announce themselves. They did not need to. The sudden drop in temperature, the metallic taste on the wind, that was announcement enough. The warriors who studied such things came to understand that the choosers were not merely observers of fate. In the high passes and the deep forests, skalds told of a loom, not a loom of wood and wool, but a loom of war. On certain nights, when the aurora burned low and green, a sound could be heard threading down from the cloud line. A low, rhythmic chant. The click of something hard against something wet. And beneath it all, a sound that might have been singing. What the Valkyries wove upon that loom was not cloth. The warp was weighted with severed heads, the mouths still open in the shapes of last words. The weft was human entrails, drawn from the abdominal cavities of the newly dead, while their souls still clung to the cooling flesh. The shuttle that passed back and forth, tightening each thread, was a sword still wet from the battle it had just ended. And the song they sang was the song of the dying, harmonized into something almost unbearable in its beauty. No mortal eye was permitted to see this weaving, but every mortal on the battlefield below felt its effects. A king who had never lost a duel would stumble inexplicably, his shield dropping an inch too low. A farmer conscripted that very morning would find his spear arm guided by an invisible hand into the gap in a champion's armor. The threads pulled tight, and men who were supposed to live died, and men who were supposed to die lived long enough to be lifted. After the song ended, and the loom fell silent, the Valkyries descended. They moved through the carnage, not as scavengers, but as auditors completing a final review. Each body was approached, each chest examined for the thin silver thread that connected a soul to its former vessel. The chooser would lean close, her face a mask of cold concentration, and she would take the thread between her fingers, not pulling, not yet. She was feeling for something, a vibration, a particular frequency that only she could detect. That frequency was endurance, not courage. Courage could break. Not strength. Strength could fail. What the Valkyries sought was the quality of a soul that would bend under pressure and spring back, that would shatter and reassemble, that would die at dawn and rise at dusk, and fight again without losing the essential shape of what it was. They tested for this the way a smith tests a blade, by listening to the ring it made when struck. The thread would hum, and in that hum was the whole truth of a life. There is no need to picture the ones who failed the test too clearly. It is enough to know that they were not punished, not condemned, merely released. The Valkyrie would open her hand, and the thread would slip through her fingers like water, falling back into the body it had tried to leave. And the warrior, already dead, would die a second death. Not into flame, not into glory, but into a silence so complete that even the gods could not hear it. For those who had passed, the experience was different. The Valkyrie's grip tightened, the thread went taut, and the soul was drawn upward through the wound that had killed it. Not painfully, but with a force that was impossible to resist. The warrior would feel himself rising, the battlefield shrinking below, the cold air giving way to a colder, thinner atmosphere. And somewhere above, a hall of golden shields was waiting, and somewhere within that hall, a mead bench with his name already carved upon it. But the unchosen, the ones whose threads had slipped through the Valkyrie's fingers, did not rise. They sank. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the soul would drift downward through the frozen earth, through layers of stone and root and old bone, until it reached a realm where no fire burned and no song was sung. Hell was not a place of torture. It was a place of stillness, and the stillness was the point. To be forgotten was the only true death the Norse cosmos recognized, and the unchosen were forgotten even by the gods who had created the choosers. The Valkyries did not dwell on this division. They did not count the unchosen or mourn the ones who failed the test. Their work was selection, not salvation. And so, as the centuries turned and the bodies piled higher on the frozen fields of Midgard, the choosers continued to ride, continued to weave, continued to open each dying soul like a ledger, and record its worth in the only currency that mattered to the wolf waiting at the end of time. What that worth was made of, and what it cost, was a question even the auditors themselves had been stripped of the capacity to ask. The warriors of Midgard were not blind to this machinery. They could not see the loom or hear the song, but they felt the threads pulling at their limbs, and they learned to read the signs. A sudden stillness in the air before a charge. A call that had no natural source. A raven circling a particular man for 3 passes before veering away. These became the grammar of dread, and every fighter, from the greenest boy to the grayest veteran, knew its vocabulary by heart. Some sought to game the system. Chieftains would order their best warriors to hold back until the chill arrived, hoping the Valkyries would mistake them for cowards, and pass them over for a man who was not chosen was a man who lived. But the auditors did not judge by appearances. They felt the thread, and the thread could not lie. The warrior who feigned cowardice, but burned with secret fury, was taken. The warrior who postured with loud bravery, but carried a brittle core, was left. There is a grave on a hillside in what was once the kingdom of the Danes. The man buried there died with a sword in his hand, his shield splintered, his body facing the enemy line. By every measure his culture possessed, he was worthy. But the Valkyrie who came to him paused only a moment before releasing his thread. No reason was recorded. No saga explains the rejection. His bones are still there, and the grass grows over them, and no one sings his name. For those who were lifted, the ascent was both a liberation and a kind of violence. The soul, accustomed to the weight of a body, was pulled skyward with a force that left it gasping. The world below flattened into a gray disk. The stars, invisible from the battlefield's smoke, opened above them in a spray of cold silver. And then the gates of Valhalla appeared, not as the golden paradise the sagas promised, but as a fortress, functional and severe, its walls lined with the shields of warriors who had arrived before them. Inside those walls the Einherjar were already fighting. They fought every day, from dawn until the last man fell, and every evening they rose again, wounds healed, to feast on the meat of the boar, Sigrdrífa. The Valkyries moved among them, not as servants, but as handlers, pouring mead into drinking horns with the same dispassionate efficiency they brought to the battlefield. They did not congratulate the warriors. They did not praise their valor. They simply kept the machinery running. The unchosen, meanwhile, had begun their long descent. Hell was not fire and torment. The Norse imagination had no need of such theatrics. Hell was a hall, vast and dim, where the benches were filled with gray shapes that had once been souls. Nothing burned there. Nothing sang. Nothing changed. The unchosen sat in silence, their memories fading like old bruises, until the last trace of who they had been dissolved into the mist and was gone. And the Valkyries, the perfect auditors, the cold harvesters, did not look back. They could not. The capacity for looking back, for wondering whether the thread they had released might have sung a different note on a different day, had been stripped from them, along with their names. They moved from field to field, age to age, their numbers slowly growing as more mortal women fell with fury in their hearts and were remade. They became a constant, like the weather, like the turning of the seasons. The battlefields themselves began to change. Certain valleys and coastal plains acquired reputations as places where the veil was thin, where the air tasted of copper, even on days when no blood had been shed. Travelers avoided them. Farmers would not plow their soil. The land itself seemed to remember the weight of all that choosing, all that release, and it held the memory in the frost that lingered too long, and the grass that grew back strangely pale. Odin watched it all from Hlitskjalf. He saw the army growing, the benches of Valhalla filling, the daily slaughter and resurrection that was forging the erasure into a weapon that might, just might, slow the wolf's jaws for a moment. He saw the unchosen sinking into silence, and he did not intervene. The calculus was clear. The few who were taken were necessary. The many who were left were acceptable losses. A general does not weep for the bullets that missed their target. The system was complete. The choosers rode. The threads were tested. The worthy rose, and the forgotten sank. And somewhere at the root of the world, the wolf grew larger. The question that now remained was not whether the harvest would continue. It would until the last battle was fought and the sky split open. The question was whether anyone, god or mortal, would ever arrive who could look at the choosers and see not a machine, but a mirror, and whether that looking would change anything at all. Chapter 4. The Long Unmaking of the Soul. The gates of Valhalla do not swing open in welcome. They are already open 540 doors, each wide enough for 800 warriors to march through side by side, and they have been open since the day the hall was finished. No sentry challenges the arriving soul. No horn announces his presence. He simply passes through, drawn by the silver thread still gripped in the Valkyrie's hand, and the cold vastness of the hall closes around him. The first thing the newly arrived warrior notices is the noise. Not music, not celebration, but the grinding, percussive roar of battle, iron on iron, shield on shield, the wet sound of blades finding flesh. The Einherjar are already fighting. They fight every day, from the moment the false dawn lights the eastern doors until the last man falls and the hall falls silent. No one pauses to greet the newcomer. No one even turns to look. He is not a guest. He is a replacement part. The Valkyrie who carried him releases his thread and departs without a word. She is already needed elsewhere. Another battlefield. Another dying man. Another soul to weigh and lift or release. The warrior stands alone at the edge of the fighting floor, still wearing the wounds that killed him, still clutching the ghost of the sword he held when he fell. He has no time to orient himself, no moment to catch his breath. A berserker with a painted face and a chipped axe is already charging toward him. The first death is the worst. Not because of the pain is brief, almost courteous, a sharp flare, and then nothing, but because of the confusion. One moment he is raising his ghost sword to parry, the next he is on his back, staring up at the distant roof of golden shields, his chest split open. He feels himself die. He feels the cold nothingness of the gap between one life and the next. And then, with a gasp that tears through his lungs like freezing water, he is whole again. Rising is a violence of its own. The body remakes itself from the inside out, bones knitting, blood reversing its flow, skin sealing over wounds that no longer exist. It takes only a few heartbeats, but those heartbeats are an eternity of dislocation. The warrior stumbles to his feet, gasping, and looks down at his unmarked chest. Across the hall, the berserker who killed him is already dead himself, his head separated from his shoulders by a spear. And then the berserker rises too, and the fighting continues. The Valkyries watch from the edges of the hall. They do not cheer. They do not wince. They stand in loose formations near the mead barrels, their storm wings folded, their faces as still as the faces of the dead they once harvested. When a warrior falls particularly hard, a spine shattered, a skull crushed, one of them might tilt her head slightly, the way a smith observes a blade being tested. But no more than that. They've seen every possible death, in every possible variation, across every possible body. Nothing surprises them. When the light begins to fade, not true sunlight, but a dim, golden glow that seems to come from the shields themselves, the battle ends. The last warrior falls, and for a moment, the hall is a carpet of corpses, hundreds upon hundreds of the dead lying in twisted heaps. And then, one by one, they rise. The air fills with the sound of gasping, coughing, the clatter of dropped weapons being retrieved. The Einherjar stretch their newly remade limbs and make their way toward the long tables. The day's work is done. The feast is about to begin. The feast is as relentless as the battle. The meat comes from Sigrdrífa, the boar who is slaughtered each night and restored each morning, his flesh tasting exactly as it did the night before and the night before that. The mead flows from the udders of the goat Heidrun, who feeds on the leaves of Yggdrasil and produces a honey-sweet, burning liquor that fills the drinking horns without ever running dry. The warriors eat until their jaws ache. They drink until their memories blur. And the Valkyries pour. It is the pouring that undoes something in the new warrior. He sits at the end of a bench, his hands still shaking from his third death. And a chooser approaches with a mead horn. Her armor is dark iron, her eyes the cold light of the aurora. She fills his horn without looking at his face. He searches her expression for some flicker of recognition. She is the one who lifted him from the mud, who held his thread in her gauntleted fingers, who chose him, but there is nothing. He is inventory. He has always been inventory. He drinks. The mead is warm and sweet, and it blunts the edge of his understanding just enough to make the feast bearable. But as he looks down the long table, past the rows of scarred faces and empty eyes, he begins to notice something that the sagas never mentioned. No one speaks of their former life. No one tells stories of the wives they left, the children they failed to protect, the kingdoms they died for. Those memories are fading, worn smooth by centuries of repetition. And one day, he will not remember his own name. The days blurred. The warrior who had arrived trembling and bewildered learned to swing his ghost blade with the rhythm of the hall, to die without fear and rise without shock. He learned which berserkers to avoid and which spearmen left openings in their guard. He learned the architecture of his own mortality, which wounds healed fastest, which deaths hurt least. And somewhere in the thousands of repetitions, he stopped thinking about the woman he had left behind in the world above. There is a particular stillness that settles over a warrior when he has forgotten his children's faces. It is not peace. It is not despair. It is a kind of erosion, the slow wearing away of the contours that made him who he was. The Einherjar did not age. Their bodies were restored each evening to the exact state in which they had been chosen, but something in their eyes aged regardless. A flatness crept in, a distance. The Valkyries, who had seen this erosion in 10,000 warriors before him, noted it and said nothing. The choosers had their own routines. When they were not riding to battlefields or pouring mead, They maintained the hall, sharpening weapons that never dulled, mending shields that never broke, counting and recounting the stores of arrows and spears. They did this work with the same dispassionate precision they brought to selecting the slain. A Valkyrie polishing a sword blade, and a Valkyrie lifting a soul wore the same expression. Focused, efficient, utterly removed from the significance of the act. Some warriors tried to speak to them. It was inevitable. Centuries of being served by the same cold hands, of being watched by the same aurora-lit eyes, bred a kind of desperate intimacy. A scarred veteran would catch a chooser's wrist as she poured his mead and ask her name. Ask her if she remembered the field where she had lifted him. Ask her if she ever dreamed of anything other than death. The Valkyrie would wait, motionless, until he released her. Then she would move on. No answer was ever given. There is no need to imagine the warrior's loneliness too vividly. It is enough to know that he sat on his bench that evening, his mead horn untouched, and watched the chooser who had lifted him move down the long table without a backward glance. She poured for the man on his left and the man on his right. She did not pour for him. She had already performed her function. The transaction was complete. The loneliness he felt was not the loneliness of being unseen. It was the loneliness of having been seen only as a number. The Einherjar were not stupid. They understood, in the dim way that erosion allows understanding, what was being done to them. They were being forged not as individual heroes, but as a single weapon, a mass of interchangeable parts that could be thrown against the wolf, again and again, until either the wolf faltered or the supply of parts ran out. The daily deaths, the nightly resurrections, the endless feasting and drilling, it was all preparation, and the Valkyries were the quartermasters of that preparation, keeping the inventory fresh and the machinery oiled. Odin walked among them sometimes. The Allfather would descend from Hilitskelf and move through the rows of feasting warriors, like a general inspecting his troops, his single eye missing nothing. He did not speak to the Einherjar either. He spoke only to the Valkyries, receiving their silent reports, adjusting the deployment schedules, calculating the rate at which the army was growing against the rate at which the wolf was approaching. The warriors were not part of this conversation. They were its subject, not its audience. A century passed, or perhaps only a decade. Time moved strangely in the hall, where every day was identical to the last. The warrior who had once been a farmer, who had once held his wife's hand in the darkness of their longhouse, who had once wept when his first child was born, found that he could no longer recall the sound of rain on a thatched roof. He could recall the sound of a blade entering his lung. He could recall the taste of mead. He could recall the exact number of steps between his bench and the eastern door where the battle began each morning. But the rain was gone. The Valkyries noticed this too. They noticed everything that was their function. But noticing was not the same as caring. The capacity to care had been removed from them, along with their names, their memories, their mothers' faces. And so the erosion of the Einherjar, the slow stripping away of everything that had made them human, proceeded without comment. The warriors were being refined into pure, unthinking function. And the choosers, who had been refined into the same thing long ago, were the perfect instruments to complete the work. The hall filled, the army grew, and somewhere in the long silence between one death and the next, a question began to form in the mind of the farmer-turned-warrior, a question he could not quite articulate, a splinter of thought that the mead could not dissolve. He looked at the Valkyrie who had chosen him, watched her cold hands pour the eternal mead, and wondered whether being saved and being damned might sometimes wear the same face. The question would not be answered in his lifetime, but it would outlive him. It would outlive all of them, except the wolf. Chapter 5. The Name She Spoke in the Fire. Not every Valkyrie remained a perfect instrument. In the long centuries of choosing, as the battlefields blurred into a single, unending harvest, a fault line began to form, small at first, almost imperceptible, a hesitation that lasted no longer than a heartbeat. Most choosers suppressed it. The bindings Odin had woven into their design smoothed the splinter away before it could become a thought. But in one, the fault widened. Her name was Sigrdrífa. She had been a shield maiden once, before the Allfather unmade her, and something of that mortal life still echoed in the hollow chamber of her chest. She performed her duties with the same cold precision as her sisters, lifting the worthy and releasing the unchosen without a flicker of emotion. But in the quiet moments between battles, when the loom was silent and the dead lay still, she found herself lingering over faces that reminded her of a life she could no longer remember. The battle that undid her was not larger or bloodier than any other. Two armies had met on a coastal plain, under a sky the color of wet slate, their shields clashing in the familiar rhythm of iron and desperation. On one side stood a king whom Odin had promised victory, a brutal, cunning man who had sacrificed 9 sons to the Allfather and worn their deaths like a cloak of favor. On the other stood a young warrior with no lineage, no sacrifice, only a courage that burned clean. Sigrdrífa descended through the storm clouds, as she had done 1,000 times before. She felt for the threads of the dying, testing each one for the vibration of endurance. That was her only criterion. The king's thread hummed with a dark, self-serving strength. Durable, yes, but twisted. The young warrior's thread sang with something pure, something that reminded Sigrdrífa of a song she had known before her name was taken. And in that moment, the fault line cracked open. She chose the young warrior. She reached down through the carnage and lifted him, leaving the king to sink into the silence of the unchosen. The act took no longer than any other choice she had ever made, but the consequences were immediate. The sky above the battlefield turned black. The air thickened until even the living warriors felt it pressing against their lungs. And Sigrdrífa, the perfect chooser, felt something she had not felt since the day Odin had unmade her, the weight of the Allfather's displeasure. Odin did not rage. He did not thunder from Helitskeshalf or hurl his spear across the heavens. His anger, when it came, was a cold and patient thing, the anger of a general who has discovered a flaw in a weapon he relied upon. He descended to the battlefield, where Sigrdrífa still stood over the body of the king she had let die, her storm wings folded, her face as still as ever. And in his hand he held a thorn, not a weapon of war, but something older, something from the first days of the world, when sleep was still a kind of death. The sleep thorn was small and dark, no longer than a finger, its tip glistening with a single drop of colorless liquid. Odin pressed it into Sigrdrífa's brow, with the same deliberate precision with which he had once unmade her mortal self. She did not resist. The fault line that had opened in her had not made her a rebel. It had only made her capable of a single choice, and that choice was now paid for. Her eyes, still holding the aurora's cold light, slowly closed. Her storm wings folded tight against her back, and she fell. He did not destroy her. The Allfather was not wasteful. A Valkyrie, even a flawed one, was too valuable to discard. Instead, he carried her to the peak of Hindorfchal, a mountain that jutted from the earth like a broken tooth, its summit wreathed in permanent cloud. There, he laid her on a bed of stone and raised around her a ring of fire, not ordinary flame, but the pale, singing fire of divine decree, which burned without fuel and killed without consuming. She would sleep, he declared, until a man brave enough to cross the flames came to wake her. And when that man came, she would be mortal again. She would know love and loss and the taste of death. She would be a woman, not a chooser. And that, to Odin, was punishment enough. The fire burned for centuries. On the peak of Hindorfchal, the seasons turned. Snow fell and melted. The aurora rippled and faded. Ravens circled and departed. But the ring of flame never dimmed. Inside it, Sigrdrífa lay motionless, her dark armor gathering frost that never melted, her face as still as a carving on a tomb. She did not dream. The sleep-thorn permitted no dreams, only an unbroken darkness that stretched from the moment of her disobedience to the moment of her awakening. Time passed over her, like wind over stone, leaving no mark. And then, on a morning that was no different from any other, a rider appeared on the slopes below Heimdorfald. His name was Sigurd, and he had already done what no ordinary man could do. He had slain the dragon Fafnir, and tasted its blood, which gave him the language of birds. The birds had told him of a mountain where fire ringed a sleeping woman in armor, and something in that story had pulled at him. Not glory, not conquest, but a recognition he could not yet name. He rode Grani, his grey stallion, and he did not slow as the flames rose before him. The flames parted for him, not because he was fearless, his heart hammered against his ribs, like a smith's hammer, but because the fire recognized something in him that Sigrdrífa herself had recognized on that distant battlefield, a courage that burned clean, a thread that hummed with a frequency the old magic could not deny. Grani's hooves struck sparks from the stone as they passed through the ring, and then the fire closed behind them, sealing them inside a circle of pale, singing light. What Sigurd saw on the stone bed was not a woman, but an effigy, a figure in dark iron armor, limbs rigid, face a mask of cold, arrested stillness. Frost had grown over the runes on her breastplate, and her storm wings were folded beneath her like a burial shroud. She did not breathe. She did not stir. But somewhere beneath the armor, beneath the frost and the centuries of silence, a thread still hummed, faint but unbroken. Sigurd dismounted. He drew his sword, Grom, the blade that had killed a dragon, and he began to cut. The blade sliced through iron and leather as if they were linen. Layer after layer of armor fell away, each cut releasing a faint sigh of trapped air, a whisper of the ancient cold that had held her. Sigurd worked with the focus of a healer, not a warrior, his hand steady, his breath shallow, his eyes never leaving her face. When the last piece of armor was removed, he stepped back and waited. The silence on the mountain was absolute. Even the fire seemed to hold its tongue. Her eyes opened. The aurora was still there, pale green and silver, but something else had joined it. A warmth, a confusion, the slow return of a self that had been buried under centuries of darkness. She looked at Sigurd, not as a chooser looks at a dying warrior, assessing his worth, but as a woman looks at a stranger who has walked through fire to find her. Her lips parted. She spoke her own name, Sigrdrífa, the first word she had uttered that was not a tally of the dead, and the sound of it cracked something open in the cold mountain air. She did not remember everything. The memories Odin had taken from her when he made her a chooser had not been restored. Only the sleep-thorn's removal could not undo that older unmaking. But something had changed. The bindings that had smoothed away every splinter of feeling were loosened now, and the fault line that had begun with a single act of defiance had widened into a chasm. She was mortal again, or something close to it. She could feel the cold stone beneath her. She could feel the heat of Sigurd's gaze, and she could feel the shape of a grief she had been carrying for centuries without knowing it. What passed between them in the hours that followed was not love, not yet. It was recognition. Two beings who had each killed something vast and terrible, who had each been shaped by forces larger than themselves, sat on a mountain peak inside a ring of fire and spoke as if no one else in the 9 realms existed. Sigurd told her of the dragon. Sigrdrífa told him of the loom, the threads, the king she had let die. And then, because she was still a chooser in her deepest self, she began to teach. The runes she gave him were not the common marks that any healer or lawgiver might carve. They were the deeper runes, victory runes, to be cut into a sword's hilt healing runes to be traced on a wound, speech runes to still a hostile hall. She spoke them aloud, and the air around them shimmered with the weight of the knowledge being transferred. A Valkyrie was designed to take souls, lives, futures. But Sigrdrífa, in her first act of full freedom, chose to give. And Sigurd, the dragon slayer, sat at her feet like a child and listened. There is a moment at the heart of every transformation when the thing that is being unmade does not yet know what it is becoming. Sigrdrífa was no longer a chooser. Odin's punishment had seen to that. But she was not yet fully mortal either. She stood in the doorway between two existences, and the doorway was narrow, and the wind that blew through it was cold. She looked at Sigurd, and she understood that to love him would be to complete her fall. Mortality was not the sleep thorn. Mortality was the choice to attach herself to a life that would end, and she had already begun to choose it. When the fire finally dimmed, and the sun broke through the clouds over Heimdallrfjall, Sigrdrífa rose from the stone bed. Her storm wings were gone. Odin had stripped them when he placed the thorn, and she moved now with the weight of a human body, her bare feet touching the cold rock for the first time in centuries. She did not look back at the circle of ash where the flames had been. She looked at Sigurd, and she spoke a promise that was also a prophecy. She would marry him, and she would die, and the dying would be worth it. Then she taught him one last rune, the rune for memory, and asked him never to forget her name. They descended the mountain together, the dragon slayer and the fallen chooser, and the world below them was still sleeping. The saga would record their love as a tragedy. Sigrdrífa betrayed, Sigurd murdered, a funeral pyre that burned high enough to touch the clouds. But none of that had happened yet. On the slopes of Heimdallrfjall, with the ash still warm beneath their feet, and the first birds beginning to sing, there was only a man and a woman who had both been weapons in the hands of gods, and who had chosen, against every law of the cosmos, to become something other than what they were made for. Chapter 6. The Silence After the Harvest. The woman who descended Heimdallrfjall was no longer Sigrdrífa. The name she had spoken in the fire belonged to a self that was already slipping away, replaced by the name the world would give her, Brynhildra, the bright battle maiden, a queen in waiting. She carried Sigurd's promise like a wound that had not yet begun to bleed, and she did not know, could not know, that the threads of fate, once woven by her own hands, were now being woven around her. The betrayal came not as a blade, but as a cup, a draught of forgetfulness, brewed by the sorcery of a queen who wanted Sigurd for her daughter, was pressed into Sigurd's hands, and he drank without knowing what he surrendered. He forgot the fire, the mountain, the runes, the name. When he next looked upon Brynhildr, he saw only a stranger, a woman to be bartered, a bride to be won for another man. And Brynhildr, who had once measured the worth of every dying soul, felt her own worth drain away in the space between his glance and his silence. She married Gunnar, the king who had sent Sigurd through the fire in his place, wearing another man's shape. She performed the duties of a queen with the same cold precision she had once brought to the battlefield, her face a mask of calm that no one thought to question. But beneath the mask, the fault line that Odin's thorn had cracked open was widening into an abyss. The chooser who had defied a god for a single act of justice could not accept a life built on a lie, and so she began to plan. There is a kind of grief that curdles into something harder than iron. Brynhildr's grief was of that kind. She did not weep. She did not rage. She simply withdrew into the cold, quiet place where the Valkyries still lived, the auditor, the weigher of souls, the being who could look at a dying man and decide his worth without flinching. And from that place, she issued her verdict. Sigurd had to die. Not because she hated him, she loved him still. with a love that had nowhere to go, but because his death was the only currency that could balance the scales. She did not wield the blade herself. That was not her function. Instead, she found men whose honor was smaller than their ambition, and whispered into their ears the shape of the deed. Sigurd was slain in his bed, a spear through his back, his dragon-blooded body offering no resistance to the cold iron. When the news reached Brynhildr, she received it in silence. The mask held, but somewhere behind her eyes, the aurora light flickered and dimmed, and the last remnant of the woman who had taught runes on a mountaintop went dark. The funeral was arranged not by Brynhildr's enemies, but by Brynhildr herself. She ordered a pyre built high enough to touch the clouds, the timber soaked in oil and resin, the body of Sigurd laid upon it in his finest armor. And then, before any hand could restrain her, she climbed onto the pyre beside him. She wore her own armor, the dark iron plates that had once been her chooser's skin, the breastplate, etched with runes that no longer bound her. She lay down beside the dragon slayer, and she waited for the flames. There is no need to imagine the fire too vividly. It is enough to know that it rose, and that it was bright, and that Brynhildr did not cry out. The woman who had been Sigrdrífa, who had been a shield maiden, who had been a chooser of the slain, chose her own end with the same clarity she had once brought to the threads of the dying. She had measured her own soul and found it worth exactly one death freely chosen, freely given. And the fire, which had once ringed her in enchanted sleep, now ringed her in a final, mortal embrace. The choosers who still rode the battlefields of Midgard did not pause in their work. They had no capacity to mourn a sister who had fallen. That splinter had been removed from them long ago. But something passed through the host, a tremor too faint to be called grief, a brief disturbance in the cold machinery of their purpose. One of their own had chosen to die. Not harvested, not repurposed, but died of love, of fury, of a grief so vast it had no name. The auditors recorded the anomaly and continued their work, but the anomaly remained, and the work continued. Century after century, the Valkyries rode. The threads were tested. The chosen rose, and the unchosen sank. The hall of Valhalla filled beyond counting, its benches groaning under the weight of an army that had been training for a war no one could name a date for. The Einherjar fought, and died, and rose, and forgot, their faces smoothing into the same hollow mask, their names fading from the sagas, and the choosers, watching from the edges, waited for the signal that would end the waiting. That signal came not as a horn, but as a winter. 3 winters, one after another, with no summer between them. The Fimble winter, the long cold that the prophecies had named. The sun grew dim, the wolves that chased it grew bold, and from the depths of the underworld, the chained ones began to stir. The Valkyries, who had spent eternity preparing for this moment, unfurled their storm wings and turned their faces toward the reddening sky. The final harvest was about to begin. The Valkyries gathered above the plains of Vigorandra, their storm wings darkening the sky in a formation that stretched from horizon to horizon. They did not speak. They had never needed speech to coordinate their work. Each chooser knew her section of the battlefield, her allotment of the doomed, her place in the geometry of the final harvest. Below them, the Einherjar poured from the doors of Valhalla centuries upon centuries of chosen warriors, marching in lockstep toward the place where the wolf was already waiting. The army moved as a single body across the Bifrost Bridge, the rainbow trembling under the weight of so many armored feet. Their faces were hollowed by millennia of repetition, their eyes empty of anything except the muscled memory of combat. They had forgotten their names, their families, the taste of bread that was not boiled in a cauldron of resurrection. But they remembered how to die, and that, in the final accounting, was all the Valkyries had ever required of them. Odin rode at the head of the host, his spear Gungnir raised, his ravens circling above him like a crown of shadow. He did not look back at the army that had cost him so much to assemble. He looked only forward, toward the gaping jaws that had haunted his visions since the first moment he hung upon the tree. Beside him, the Valkyries maintained their cold vigilance, their aurora-lit eyes scanning the ranks, already calculating the rate at which the chosen would fall. Even now, they were auditors first. On the plain of Sigrdrífa, the forces of chaos had already assembled. Fenrir, the wolf whose hunger had shaped the entire machinery of selection, broke his chains and lunged forward with a howl that cracked the sky. Sutra, the fire giant, raised his blazing sword and set the horizon alight. And Loki, freed from his punishment, led the legions of the dishonored dead, the unchosen, the forgotten, the souls the Valkyries had released without a backward glance. They had come for their reckoning. The battle was not a battle. It was a convergence of forces so vast that individual acts of courage became invisible, swallowed by the scale of the destruction. Odin rode to meet the wolf, and was consumed in a single motion. The Allfather, the architect of the entire harvest, disappearing into the darkness he had spent eternity trying to arm against. The Valkyries, watching from above, did not pause. They had been created for this outcome. The death of a god was within operational parameters. The Einherjar fell in waves, their centuries of training insufficient against the raw hunger of the wolf and the fire of Surtur. They died as they had always died, efficiently, without complaint, their bodies piling in heaps that would never rise again. The Valkyries moved above the carnage. Not to lift souls, there were no more souls to lift, no more halls to fill, but to observe, to record, to complete the final audit of a war that had consumed every resource they had ever gathered. When the last Einherjar fell and the fire began to consume the world, the Valkyries remained. They hovered above the burning plain, their storm wings singed by the heat of Surtur's sword, their dark armor glowing red in the light of the dying cosmos. Their purpose was complete. The wolf had been fed, the army had been spent, and the choosers, who had never been permitted to ask what any of it meant, now faced a silence that no new command would fill. The world sank into the sea. The old gods were dead. The old halls burned. The old harvest ended. But something lingered in the ash that settled over the cooling waters. The Valkyries, or what remained of them, drifted above the new world that rose from the waves. A world without war, without choosers, without the machinery of selection that had defined their existence. They had been built for a purpose that no longer existed, and they had never been given the capacity to choose a new one. Not every trace of the old order was erased. In the darkness beneath the new earth, the hall of hell still stood, its benches still filled with the unchosen, the souls who had slipped through the Valkyries' fingers century after century, still silent, still waiting. No fire would ever warm them. No horn would ever call them to battle. They were the permanent remainder of the system's cold calculus, and not even Ragnarök had been designed to release them. And somewhere in the memory of the few Valkyries who still drifted above the quiet seas, the splinter of a name remained. Sigrdrífa, Brynhildr, the chooser who had chosen to die. Her story had not saved the world. It had not changed the system, but it had proven, in the face of all Odin's bindings, that even a being made for pure function could find the fault line in its own design and break itself open. The new world would not remember her, but the silence that held her name was a different kind of silence than the one that held the unchosen. And that difference, small as it was the only seed the old order left behind. Chapter 7. The Witness Who Outlasted the War. After the fire and the flood, the world grew quiet. The Valkyries, who had survived Ragnarök, drifted above the new seas, like gulls whose fishing grounds had vanished. They had been built to harvest souls for a war that was now over, and no new command replaced the old one. The silence that settled over them was not peace. It was the absence of function, a stillness they had never been equipped to understand. And in that stillness, their story began to become something other than what Odin had designed. The Norse did not fear death. They feared a death that left no trace. In a world where memory was the only afterlife that mattered, to die unremembered was to die twice, once in the body, once in the telling. The Valkyrie was the answer to that terror, a divine witness, a sacred accountant who recorded the transaction of a life given bravely and marked it as received. She was not a goddess of death. She was a goddess of the ledger, and the ledger was the only immortality the Norse truly trusted. What the Valkyrie selected for, in the end, was not the warrior's soul, but the warrior's story. The thread she lifted was the thread that would be woven into a saga, sung by a skald, carved onto a runestone. The unchosen sank not into torment, but into anonymity, which, to the Norse, was the only true hell. And so, the chooser became the culture's most potent symbol, not of glory, but of the terrible vulnerability of needing to be seen by someone in the moment you stop breathing. For centuries, scholars searched for the seed of this myth in the hard soil of history, and in the grave fields of Birka, in the stone-lined chamber of a warrior buried with sword and axe and shield, they found something that shifted the ground. The skeleton, long assumed to be male, was female, a shield maiden, a woman who had died with a blade in her hand, just as the sagas described. She was not a Valkyrie, but she may have been their origin real women, whose courage was so exceptional that it demanded a divine explanation. Other graves confirmed the pattern. Across Scandinavia, the bodies of women interred with weapons, horses, and gaming pieces, the tools of a war leader, emerged from the earth one by one, each one complicating the old assumption that the Viking world was a world of men alone. The Valkyrie, in this light, was not a fantasy imposed on reality. She was a reflection of a reality that history had forgotten. The woman who fought, who led, who chose the moment of her own death and met it with her eyes open. But the myth traveled further than the archaeology. It passed from the Norse into the wider Germanic world, where it shed its cold accounting logic and grew warmer, softer, more palatable. The corpse chooser became the golden maiden. The shield maiden became the opera heroine, and the terrible auditor of the battlefield became a beautiful woman on a winged horse who welcomed heroes into paradise with a cup of mead and a smile. The dread was polished away. What remained was the beauty, and the beauty lied. Richard Wagner, in the 19th century, took what remained of the myth and set it to music. The Ride of the Valkyries, those crashing, soaring brass chords, became the soundtrack of the Valkyrie in the modern imagination. And with it came a visual language that has never released its grip. Brunhilde in her horned helmet, her spear, her fat pony of a horse, her operatic vibrato. It was thrilling. It was triumphant. And it had almost nothing to do with the gaunt, silent being who had once walked through the frozen mud of a real battlefield, opening each dying soul like a ledger. From Wagner, the image diluted further into comic books, into films, into the blonde warrior in gleaming armor who appears for a few minutes of screen time and then vanishes. The name Valkyrie became a brand, a metaphor for any strong woman, any female fighter, any symbol of feminine power. The coldness was erased entirely. The tragedy was erased entirely. What remained was a costume, and the question that had haunted the original myth, the question of what it means to be chosen, and what it costs to be passed over, was buried under 1,000 glossy images of winged women in breastplates. But if you listen carefully, even now, you can hear the echo of the older story beneath the noise. It is there in the quiet moment after the music stops, when the audience has gone home and the stage is dark. It is there in the grave at Birka, where the bones of a woman who may have inspired the myth still lie. Her weapons beside her, her name forgotten. The Valkyrie was never about the glory of the chosen. She was about the terror of the unchosen, and the loneliness of the chooser, and the cold mathematics of a cosmos that needed warriors more than it needed mothers. And the mathematics had a final variable that the sagas never solved. If the chosen were forged into weapons and fed to a wolf, and the unchosen were left to dissolve into silence, then which fate was the mercy? The Einherjar were given eternity, but eternity was just a long training exercise for a death they could not avoid. The unchosen were given oblivion, but oblivion was also peace, a silence that asked nothing, demanded nothing, and never once pretended to be a reward. The Valkyrie, in the end, was not a savior. She was a mirror, and the face in the mirror was always your own. There's a particular silence that lives in the space between a myth and its retelling. It is the silence of what was lost in translation, not of language, but of meaning. The Valkyrie who walked the frozen fields of the Eddas was a creature of terrible, beautiful precision, a being who weighed souls without sentiment. The Valkyrie who survived into the modern world is a golden girl on a winged horse. Her coldness warmed into a smile, her ledger replaced with a drinking horn. And the difference between these two figures is the difference between a culture that understood death and a culture that has forgotten it. To the Norse, the Valkyrie was not a fantasy. She was a diagnosis. She named the deepest wound of the warrior's soul, the need to believe that someone was watching, that the courage it cost to die well would be recorded somewhere, by something, in a currency that outlasted the body. The terror of the unchosen was not the terror of punishment, it was the terror of invisibility. To die and not be seen was to have lived without consequence, and a life without consequence was not a life at all. The Valkyrie was the cure for that terror, and she was also its cause. What the Norse could not have known, what they could only encode in the terrible beauty of their choosers, was that the system they built to honor courage would also consume it. The Einherjar were not saved. They were stockpiled, and the stockpile was always destined for the wolf. The Valkyrie's hand, lifting the worthy from the mud, was also the hand that fed the machine. To be chosen was to be useful. To be useful was to be spent. And the only reward for a life of valor was the right to die one last time in a battle that erased the world. Perhaps that is why the unchosen warrior, the one whose thread slipped through the Valkyrie's fingers, has lingered in the margins of this story from the very beginning. Do you remember him? The man on the frozen hillside? His hand still gripping his sword, his eyes open and vacant. He did not rise to Valhalla. He sank into the silence of hell, forgotten by the gods and the sagas alike. At the time, it seemed the cruelest fate the cosmos could offer. But from the other side of Ragnarok, looking back, something else becomes visible in that silence. He was not forged into a weapon. He was not fed into a wolf. He did not spend centuries dying and rising and dying again, his memories worn away like stones in a river, until he could no longer recall the sound of rain. He was simply left where he fell, and the silence that received him asked nothing of him. It did not pretend to be a reward. It did not call itself glory. It was just silence, the same silence that waits for every living thing at the end of its story, regardless of whether a chooser witnessed it or not. And in that silence, there was a kind of mercy that Valhalla never offered. The Norse, for all their wisdom, could not quite bring themselves to see this. They needed the Valkyrie to mean something. They needed the selection to be real, the ledger to be accurate, the reward to be worth the cost. And so they told the stories, and carved the runes, and died with swords in their hands, hoping that a cold hand would reach down and lift them. They could not imagine that the better fate might have been to be passed over, to be allowed to end, to be permitted the same darkness that comes for heroes and cowards alike. The Valkyrie, in her cold perfection, was never designed to offer that permission. And yet one of her own found it. Sigrdrífa, Brynhildra, the chooser who chose to die. She did not wait for a Valkyrie to lift her. She did not ask permission from the Allfather or the Norns. She walked into the fire of her own will, beside the man she had loved and destroyed. And she became the one thing no Valkyrie had ever been, a soul that selected itself. Her story was a tragedy by every measure the Norse possessed. But it was also the only moment in the entire machinery of selection when the machinery broke, and something human emerged from the wreckage. The new world that rose from Ragnarök did not remember her name. The sagas that survived were written by Christians, who smoothed the old myths into something safer, something that would not trouble a convert's sleep. The Valkyries became angels, or demons, or metaphors. The cold auditor of the battlefield faded into a poetic image, and then into a cliché. But the seed that Brynhildr planted, the fault line, the splinter of memory, the possibility that a being made for pure function could choose to be something else, that seed did not die. It simply waited, in the silence, for a listener who could hear it. If you stand on a hill in the old Norse lands today, when the wind is right and the light is low, you can still feel the edge of the story. Not the golden maiden, not the opera heroine, not the comic book warrior, but the original. The gaunt figure in dark armor, her storm wings folded, her aurora-lit eyes fixed on something just beyond the horizon. She is not waiting for a battle. There are no battles left that need her. She is simply present, a witness who has outlasted every war she ever watched, carrying the memory of every thread she ever lifted and every thread she ever released. And she asks nothing of you, except that you see her as she was. The Valkyrie was not a monster. She was not a savior. She was a question that the Norse asked themselves, generation after generation, every time they lifted a sword and walked toward the shield wall. Am I worthy? Will I be seen? Will my death mean something? Or will it disappear into the cold ground and leave no trace? That question has never been answered. It has only been handed down from the Norse to us, in the stories we tell about the choosers of the slain. And somewhere in the long quiet after the last saga has been read, a Valkyrie is still listening, and she is still choosing. And the choice, as it always was, is yours.